Good morning. Welcome to Adult Forum. I think many of you already know our speaker today as you've enjoyed her Bible study classes this year. Mindy Erdmann has been our intern, and today she will lead us on another topic of great interest. Welcome.
Thanks, Nelson, and thanks everybody. Morning. My name's Mindy Erdmann. I moved to Durham about 4 years ago to attend Duke Divinity School. My husband has a business here, and he's got family here, so we're going to stick around. I graduate this year, and I'm excited to be here in Durham. And last week at the Adult Forum...
Go ahead and mention his business. It's all right.
Yeah, okay. So if anyone has any work for him, he is an art conservator. It's a very interesting job. So he fixes and restores three-dimensional artwork, so sculpture, decorative objects, things like that. So, and he has connections. I know Fran and Jack have used his connections to get some things done for themselves, but he focuses on three-dimensional stuff. So if you know anybody that's got a collection, send them our way. Last week at Adult Forum there was a lament and reflection for Lent on the congregation's history with race. This was prompted by a lot of discussions over the last year at the congregation, and we recognize the need to be always self-examining to see how we're moving forward, since this is, as a congregation, we really want to address issues of racial injustice and reconciliation. And at the beginning of last week's Adult Forum, a few people shared some of their stories of race from sort of maybe when they first realized that race was an issue. And for those of us who are white, that doesn't always happen as early as it does for people of color. And so it's always an interesting thing to think back for those of us who are white and ask the question, when did we first realize we were white? Because it's not something we often think about. And I'm going to share today a little bit more, a little bit longer version of a story of my own journey in race and discovering I was white and discovering what that meant and how I navigate that in the worlds that I've been in. I'm just going to let you know where we're headed here. So after I share a bit about my story, I'm going to talk a bit about white culture. I think another thing we often don't recognize, because white culture is sort of normative, we don't even realize that white people have a culture. There's a lot of nuance with differences between racial issues and ethnic issues. So many of us might recognize some German heritage or Eastern European heritage, and there's some ethnic culture that we recognize, whether with food or traditions or that kind of thing. But whiteness as a racial category also has some cultural aspects. So we'll talk about that. And then at the end, I want to talk about white people work. So in this work of racial justice, as white people, what should our work be? So those of you joining us who may not identify as white, I hope that you will maybe learn something, but also you probably already know more than many of us do about this issue. People of color tend to understand more about whiteness than white people do. I also want to say that these conversations can be a little bit scary, because there's just a lot of tension and emotion around issues of race. So I recognize that myself. I may say something that you may disagree with. I may say something wrong that somebody should call me up and correct me over. I think a lot of times we allow the fear of this conversation and this topic to prevent us from saying anything at all. And I'd rather risk saying something wrong in this conversation and say something than just not say anything. So that's where we're going. I'm aiming to speak for about 45 minutes and then leave some time for questions. So if you have any questions as I go, there will be a chance to address those later. Oh, not there yet. All right, so my story. So my first memory of recognizing whiteness as a thing and that I was white was in middle school. And I had been, I'm from Southern Ohio. My roots are very Appalachian. West Virginia, Southern Ohio is where my family is from for generations. But my dad was in the Marines, so we moved around a lot when I was younger. And we ended up on military bases or in communities that had a lot of military, so they tended to be more diverse than the areas that I had come from. And in middle school, I was at a school that was somewhat racially diverse, and I had a dear friend who was African American, and we were one day on a field trip. We were playing this game, a word association game, where there's some kind of rhythm that you do, and somebody says a word, and then the next person says a word that comes to mind after that word, and then the next person, and you go around the circle. And so we were playing this game, and it comes to somebody and they say milk, and then it comes to somebody and they say white, and then it comes to my friend Anika, and she says, all my friends. And at that moment, I thought, well, and then she sort of laughed it off, and she changed her word. Like she didn't stick with that. So I realized at that moment that whiteness was something that mattered to her, and that she noticed, and I recognized that most of the friends in our friend group were white, and that also must mean something to her. And I don't know how much I realized at the time, but thinking back, the fact that she sort of laughed about it uncomfortably and then changed the word, made me wonder, or makes me wonder now, what did she associate with that word white as a racial group, and what did that mean to her that many of her friends were white and she didn't feel comfortable just letting that stand. So that was my first sort of recognition that this was an issue. As I grew up and then went to college, I was in college in the 90s, and I was involved with InterVarsity Christian Fellowship, which is a predominantly and historically, well, actually, it's no longer predominantly white. It's, I think it's about 51% people of color involved, students and staff. But at the time, predominantly white, historically white evangelical organization. And in the mid-90s, there was a lot of talk in some evangelical circles about racial reconciliation. And that was something that I heard about and was really interested in. I went on an urban plunge my freshman spring break, which was a trip into the city of Cleveland. It was sort of an urban short-term missions trip. And rather than being just a service opportunity, we sort of had, it was all white students going on this trip. And we sort of had this idea that we're going in to bring God to this God-forsaken inner city. And what I found was that God was already there, and that there were people in the city that knew God and were full of joy, and that I needed to learn from. And so that shifted my understanding of justice and mission and ministry to be about coming into spaces that with an attitude of humility, recognizing that I'm not bringing God anywhere. God is already in those spaces, and my job is to open my eyes up to where God might be working. So through InterVarsity, I had a lot of opportunities to explore these issues of race, and through my early 20s, I was involved with both urban work and starting to recognize racial justice as an issue. In 2003, I attended a pilgrimage for reconciliation, which was an amazing opportunity to travel from Atlanta, Georgia to Oklahoma, following the Cherokee Trail of Tears. And we learned from Randy Woodley, who's a Cherokee Christian theologian, and learning about the history that I had never heard about, how the Cherokee people and other Native peoples had been forced off their land and marched out west to reservations. On the way back east, we studied the civil rights movement and the history of Black Americans. And Jimmy McGee and Bob Hunter were two people that taught us on that part of the journey, as well as Lisa Sharon Harper, who was on that. That was an amazing opportunity, first to learn history I had never heard before. And it was shocking, and it was just devastating to learn these things and to recognize I had never heard these things before. It was also an amazing opportunity and experience to learn those things in the context of a very diverse group. The staff, InterVarsity staff that attended that pilgrimage were African American, Latina and Latino, Native American, Asian American. As a white person, I was one of like 3 white people on the trip. And so having those discussions in such a diverse community and coming to grips with that history in such a diverse community was hard. And I said a lot of things that now I look back on and think it's amazing that we all made it through there. But that group of people, we still keep in touch. We had a Zoom call last summer, and that experience really shaped me going forward. So that was 2003. Over the next decade or so, I was working with InterVarsity. I was also teaching in various capacities where I found myself, my intention was after college to go work in the inner city as a teacher. I kept trying to do that and it just didn't work. The Cleveland public school system lost my application, and the only jobs I could get were in more wealthy, predominantly white communities. And I started to recognize that God was calling me to be a bridge rather than doing this direct service in these communities that were struggling with poverty and injustice and discrimination. I was placed in places where it was predominantly white, middle class, who I wanted to help build a bridge so that they recognized the needs. This is the work I was doing for about a decade, and then 2012, Trayvon Martin was killed, and then in 2014, Michael Brown and then Tamir Rice were killed. And I lived in Cleveland, so I was very aware of Tamir Rice and read everything I could find on that case and on what happened. So this was something that was becoming more and more compelling for me that I needed to be involved in. So in 2015, a year after Michael Brown was killed, I had the opportunity with InterVarsity to go to Ferguson, Missouri, and learn from some InterVarsity staff who were there working in St. Louis, but also Ben McBride, Tracy Blackman, and some others, ministers who were involved with a lot of the protests and caring for the young people who were protesting in Ferguson. And even though I'd already been working towards racial justice and aware of these issues of race for a while at that point, this experience in Ferguson was another life-changing event where I recognized how far I had to go personally, and also how little I still knew about the realities of race in our country. There were just some amazingly shocking things that we saw and heard when we were there. Just hearing about what was actually happening in Ferguson from the people who were actually living there rather than what the media was portraying. There were also some things going on with the police while we were there that we actually showed up. We were with a group called Hands Up United, which is one of the first for the grassroots Black Lives Matter, one of the first organizations that kind of was at the beginning of the Black Lives Matter movement. When there was a call that a bulletin that a police officer had shot someone in Ferguson, so we actually went to the scene to see what was happening, and seeing what was happening in front of us, and then hearing the reports in the media about what the police were saying about what was happening. There were two different things. We were seeing in one thing on the ground. We were hearing reports that were different according to media outlets who were saying police have informed us, police reports say this is what happened, and we were seeing something different. But one of the most sort of eye-opening experiences for me was working with this organization called Hands Up United, which was started by a man who goes by T-Dub-O. He's a rapper in St. Louis. He's a very well-known and very skilled rap artist who lived in Ferguson, grew up there, was there the day that Michael Brown was killed, and saw his body lying in the street for 4 hours uncovered, with the police not letting anybody near, even his mother, to go close to his body. He was sharing about how that impacted him and his community, and he started sharing about his love for his community and his desire to see his children and other children in the community have different opportunities than he did. He and some other people in the organization, young people, talked about what they had given up in order to pursue this work of justice that they were doing. And as I was listening to him, I realized how surprised I was to hear him talking with such compassion and such commitment to his community. And I realized how, even after the years of being aware of racial justice and the need for diversity and the need for friendships across racial lines, because of the way this man looked and because of his history and because of his story, I had assumed that I would not hear this kind of compassion and love and commitment and concern from someone who looked like him. I realized that this man looked more like Jesus than many of the people I had met at church or in ministry, in terms of the way he was loving his community. So that was a personal wake-up call, like I still have work to do on my own assumptions and prejudices. And at the time, the work I was doing with InterVarsity was focusing on this urban plunge. I went on staff with IV to develop this program of bringing students into the city. And I realized that, well, not just in this moment, but over the years, that the program had been designed primarily assuming white students were going to come on it. And so the purpose of the program was sort of to let white students know about these issues. So as our community, in InterVarsity, as our student groups became more diverse and as we had more ethnic specific chapters on campuses, more and more of the students coming on this project were not white students. And they were not getting much out of this experience because it wasn't designed for them. It wasn't answering the questions they had. And so we started making changes to the program to expand it to be not just about educating white students, but about helping students of color recognize that the justice work that they cared about in their communities was actually in line with the gospel and in line with scripture, and that there were leaders of color in the city, there were theologians of color thinking about these things theologically, and we started bringing more and more of those voices into the work we were doing. So that's a little bit of my story. I ended up coming to Duke because I wanted to do the kind of work I was doing with students, with churches, and so that's what I'm hoping to do after I leave Duke Divinity. But in all of this work, I've really learned about what white culture looks like, what are some characteristics and aspects of it, and what harm can be done by it in some cases. So I want to start by saying I think these conversations, people have been having these conversations a lot more in recent years than when I was in my 20s. So I think a lot of us maybe have already started thinking more about this. But there's a lot of nuance, and there's a lot of, like I said, fear around these issues. So whiteness, just for a quick historical overview, whiteness was created specifically as a category to give some people rights and take rights away from other people. So that people didn't start talking about white people until colonization and slavery. And at that point, whiteness was white was closer to God, white was civilized, white was where what the job of white people was to go into places where people weren't white and bring those people up to the level of whiteness, if possible, but sometimes they didn't think that was possible. So when I talk about whiteness, that's what I'm talking about, that historical category that was created specifically to justify colonization and enslavement. But because of how much that was embedded into the culture that was then spread all over the world, that there became a culture of whiteness that was not, that went beyond the ethnic distinctions within whiteness. So Western European, German, Irish, British, there are cultural distinctives in those ethnic categories. But once whiteness became a thing, and you had to be white in order to own land in the colonies, you had to be white in order to take your case to court in certain cases, whiteness became a category different than the ethnic categories. And it gained its own culture. So I want to share this. Let's see if I can move the. These are some cultural values and assumptions, and I want to point out the ones on the left tend to be white cultural values and assumptions. And when I say that these are white cultural values and assumptions, I don't mean that these are exclusively assumptions or values that only white people care about. So they're not exclusive, but they are distinctive. And the column on the right is not necessarily values and assumptions for another culture, but they are just a different way of looking at things or a different way of being than what's on the left. So I'm not putting these into distinct categories that are, with solid boundaries. There's a lot of give and take, but in my work in mostly white organizations, especially in my relationships with people of color in those organizations, I've found that on the left, these are a lot of cultural distinctives for white culture. And this is partly based on my own observations and my own experience, but it's also based on some resources that I'm going to share at the end that kind of make lists and sort of communicate and articulate some of these things. So I want to go through some of these. On the left, again, these tend to be white cultural values and assumptions. Hyper-individualism is one, and this looks like rugged individualism, self-reliance, independence, autonomy is highly valued and rewarded. One more caveat I wanted to make. Just because these things are distinctive of white culture does not make them bad, and it does not make them wrong, necessarily. There are times and places where these work. Where it can go wrong is when the values and assumptions on the left are assumed to be the best way of doing things in all cases. So if you have an organization or a community that's predominantly white and has these cultural values and assumptions, there's a tendency to think that this is the best way to do things, and that anybody who wants to do it differently is not going to be doing it in the best way. And so it makes people who don't do things this way feel not entirely welcome, or not entirely like they have a place in the community to make changes or to do things differently. So I just want to keep that in mind. I'm not saying that these things are bad necessarily, but what's bad is when you force others into these ways of being, or when you assume that this is the only way of being, or the only way of getting something done of value. So hyper-individualism can be difficult, and a different way of thinking about things, rather than focusing on independence and self-reliance, cooperation and a communal focus is another way of looking at things. And I want to point out some ways where I've seen the white cultural values kind of go wrong. And one of those is here at the Divinity School. I've heard from professors who are people of color that in academia, in order to get tenure in most places, you have to have a monograph. So you have to, or more than one. You have to have written a book entirely by yourself, or not entirely, nobody writes anything entirely by themselves, but it has to have your name on it. If you've written and published things in collaboration with other people, it doesn't count towards your tenure. So there's a way where it's holding people back who are coming from communities where collaboration and cooperation is more valued and is the way things are done. The second row, objectivity, rationality, and quantitative valuation. So white culture tends to want to see the results. Tell me the numbers, what has changed. If you do this, we want to see these results. But another way of looking at those issues that fall under that line is story and narrative can be really important, and qualitative valuations rather than quantitative. And the way I've seen this work out is in my work with InterVarsity in particular. It's a nonprofit organization that runs on donations, and so there's a need to communicate to donors what their money is doing for them. And the best way to do that, according to the way things are usually done in those settings, is numbers. So how many converts have you had? How many people are in prayer meetings? How many students are doing Bible study? And when that's how you evaluate the success of an organization, there can be a focus then on growth and on numbers and not a focus on depth. We don't know how many of those students in Bible study are really actually becoming more like Jesus, because that's a quantitative evaluation. And how do you evaluate that? It's hard. We don't know if those people who have converted are 6 months later, are they in a Christian community? Are they still growing, or was it a decision that was made at an event that then never went anywhere? And if you're focusing on qualitative and on numbers, you don't always know what's actually happening on the ground. And I will give InterVarsity credit. They are trying to find different ways of measuring some of those things. So I know they do a lot of follow-up with their conversion numbers to track people down later after an event and make sure that they're in community. But it's a hard thing to do when you have to give numbers to donors to justify the use of, how you're spending their money. Thirdly, we've got a history that's focused on the Northern European immigrant experience rather than history from other perspectives. And just an example of this, in one of the many opportunities I had to learn from Randy Woodley and some others, there's a book called Voices in the Stones, I think it is, that the preface of it tells the history of Western expansion in the U.S., in the colonies, but from the perspective of the people who lived on the West Coast at the beginning. And if you tell the story of so-called Western expansion from the perspective of the people who already lived on the West Coast, it's a very different story than what we all got in our American history classes. And it opens up a lot of perspective, and it brings up a lot of questions. So yeah, that's something I had never thought of until I read this preface and thought, wow, I never thought about what it would look like for these European people to start moving into my territory if I put myself in that person's place. Fourthly, we've got Protestant work ethic. Hard work leads to success. Another way to look at that is that there are many factors that contribute to success. If you focus on hard work leads to success, that might mean that if you don't reach your goals, you didn't work hard enough, and all you have to do is work harder, and then you'll reach your goals. I experienced that in my work with InterVarsity again as a young single woman without a Christian background. When I was fundraising at the very beginning of my time with InterVarsity, I didn't have a network of people who could support me. I didn't have a home church that could support me. I didn't have family. But the training I got from InterVarsity was designed for people who had those networks, and whether intentionally or not, when I wasn't reaching my fundraising goals, the answer was, well, you just haven't done enough. You need to work harder. You need to write more letters. You need to, but there was a lot more that was going on that wasn't being addressed. And again, that was in the late 90s. A lot has changed since then, but I think there are still a lot of ways in which fundraising organizations where the people have to raise their own funds, there's still a lot of inequity based on this idea that hard work will get you where you need to go. We've got future orientation, which tends to be how white culture works. We're thinking about where are we headed, what are we going to do now to make things better in the future. But other cultures can be more present and past oriented. Native American culture, I've learned a lot about how just images and stories of if you're standing on a piece of land and thinking about who are all of the people who have lived on this land and stood on this land in the past. And if we could orient ourselves towards that, how might we do things differently in the moment? Efficiency is highly valued in white culture, and there's a lot of time values. We want to start things and end things on time. We want to get a lot done, so we're going to go straight to the list of things to do. But in other cultures, flexibility and consensus is valued, and flexibility and consensus take a lot of time. I was at a training with Randy Woodley with about 30 people, and it was at his home. He had invited us all in his home. We were in his living room, and we had about 2 hours, and he had 2 hours probably worth of stuff to teach us. But the way he started the meeting was, he said, I would like each of you to go around and tell me your name and where you're from. He didn't put it that way, but your name and where you're from, and tell us something vulnerable about yourself. So the first person shared, and then the next person shared, and I could tell most of us, not all of us, a lot of us in the room were white, and even some of the people who weren't white were kind of counting the people in the room and thinking, okay, that was about 2 minutes, and we've got about 30 people here. If everybody does this, we're going to be here a long time. And it did. It took almost 2 hours for us to go around the room and have everybody share. And Randy went last, and he explained that this was important for us to do this because, and this is not only about the time, but also about issues of hierarchy and vulnerability and those kinds of things. He said, I have things to teach you, but you have things to teach me. And if we don't know anything about each other, we can't really learn from one another. So now that we know each other better, we're in a space where we'll be better able to learn. So he was valuing relationship, consensus, collaboration. He also talked about Native communities where a town council meeting, it's a value that every single person there gets a chance to speak. And there's no passes, like everybody speaks. So these meetings could take days because they deeply value hearing everybody's voice. As far as issues of justice, white culture tends to focus on protecting property and entitlements. Justice often is retribution focused. Other ways of doing it are justice focusing on relationship and restoration. There's a lot of restorative justice stuff out there right now that is looking at the issue of the justice system in terms of restoration rather than retribution. White culture tends to be action and achievement oriented. There's a desire to do things. We have to do things. We have to get things done. But there can also be cultures of patience and recognizing who we are and focusing on being rather than doing. Things don't get done as quickly or as fast, but other things happen when we're able to take things slow and have patience and focus on being rather than doing. White culture tends to avoid conflict and intimacy and showing emotion. In other situations, conflict is seen to lead to stronger relationships, and emotions are a welcome part of what's happening. Emotions aren't seen as something that needs to be set aside when decisions are being made, but emotions can be listened to and taken into account. And then finally, I see it in a lot of white culture, there's a concern with image that leads to a lot of posturing, or branding is a big thing. Like we want to project a certain image of trust or of strength to people who are, the people in our organization or people in other parts of the world. But other cultures might be more concerned with authenticity and vulnerability than they are with projecting an image that says we're strong and we know what we're doing. There can be a space for leaders or organizations to have more of a concern for authenticity and vulnerability. So that's just, there's more, there's a lot more. I left some things on some of my lists out. There's more stories I could tell about ways that if these values on the left are taken as the way we do things, where that's done harm, not only to the people of color in the organization, but that is often what happens. And within a university, which is the organization I'm the most familiar with, there has been a high turnover of staff of color because navigating in an organization that runs in a very white cultural way is exhausting. They often have to do a lot of educating of their peers. They sometimes have to educate their supervisors about why they're not succeeding under these circumstances. Sometimes they're not believed. Often they choose to go someplace where they can operate in a way that's more natural and effective for them. But these things also harm white people in these cultures, I think, or they can. Not every white person operates well under these circumstances either. This is not, there are individuals who do things differently. Gender and disability and sexuality are all other factors that can play into whether or not an environment like this is going to be a place where you can succeed and grow. There's a lot more that could be said here, but for the sake of time, I'll leave it here. And I want to go on to talk about what is the work for white people to do. I think I'll leave this slide up for now. There's a few things that I see as a white person, what I feel like is where I feel like my work is and where I want to encourage others of us to consider. One is understanding our own racial and ethnic identity. So exploring the ways that our ethnic identity, and I ethnically identify as Appalachian, and I came to understand that after I read J.D. Vance's book, Hillbilly Elegy. And a lot of the experiences he was talking about there were familiar to me, and I recognized, oh, this isn't just my family, this is a cultural thing. And I began to see more how that culture had influenced the way my family operates and some of my experiences growing up. And then, so understanding that has helped me sort of recognize a little bit more why I do things the way I do, why I think about things the way I do, and then also recognizing the ways that I have operated in whiteness and what that looks like. So understanding our own racial and ethnic identity is our first step, and we can do that through reading books. There's a lot of books out there now, and again, I have a slide at the end with some resources, but some of you might have done the book study on, or the book club on Be the Bridge. Be the Bridge has some wonderful resources on whiteness. Their Be the Bridge 101 program is a series of discussions around whiteness and exploring what that looks like. And then as far as exploring your ethnic identity, speaking with family members or looking back at childhood traditions or foods or things that you grew up with and recognizing that these come from specific generations that have been passed, things that have been passed down over the generations, and just gives us more of a sense of who we are and a richness of our heritage and where we come from. And one of the reasons I think that ethnic work is important is because in this country, when you had to prove that you were white in order to do certain things like have own land and things like that. There's actually court cases you can go back and look at in U.S. courts where when Eastern European immigrants first started coming, they weren't considered white. And they weren't allowed to own land or to do certain things because they weren't white according to the law. So they would go to court and say, I am white, I have a right. And they had to prove in court that they were white. And so through our history, what white meant was kind of, defined through those kinds of experiences. And there were times where sometimes Hungarian immigrant would be declared white for these reasons, and sometimes in a different court they would be declared not white for these reasons. So it's all very arbitrary. So anyway, the point is that many people have had to give up their ethnic heritage and identity in order to fit into whatever whiteness was at the time. And so we've lost a lot of that ethnic identity and that connection to our past because of that. And this happens not only white people with white skin do this, but people of color also have to give up culture and heritage. And I mean, people who were enslaved here lost any connection to the people and the culture and the languages that they had before they came here. So one of the results of whiteness has been people having to give up their ethnic heritage in order to become white and partake in the privileges that being white in this country gives us. So our first step is understanding our own racial and ethnic identity. And secondly is paying attention to the institutions and communities that we're a part of to start recognizing where white cultural values and assumptions are at work. Not so that you can point it out and say how wrong it is necessarily, but we want to recognize it and we want to start asking questions. Is this cultural value or assumption allowing everybody in our organization to thrive? Is it preventing some people from thriving? And is there something we need to do to change it? It's a long and slow process, but I think since white people tend to have a lot of power in a lot of the institutions that we're in, if we can start recognizing where white cultural assumptions and values are working and doing harm in our communities and organizations, we are more likely to have the power to make changes than a person of color who's seeing this. Thirdly, and this is a quote from one of the resources that I have, if I can. So Robert Jensen, I think he's a professor at the University of Texas or somewhere in Texas, and he's written a book called The Heart of Whiteness. It's a really, I think I have a copy of it with me actually. It's a really thin, short book, really helpful introduction to what whiteness is. And what he says towards the end of that is that, in short, I've come to realize that my political work as a middle-class white man in the United States is primarily with the white middle class. But that work is always more than simply providing information or analysis. More important is breaking through the willed ignorance, the purposeful non-knowing about racialized consequences of our social, political, and economic structures and policies. The not knowing that makes possible the comfortable lives that we of that race and class lead. The task is to give people who otherwise need not care about justice a reason to care. This is, I think, where some of the heart of things is. What our work, we at the congregation last week at the adult forum, we talked about what are the things that we've been doing to bring justice, to bring racial equity, to learn more about these issues. And there's been a lot of reading, a lot of discussions, a lot of supporting organizations and reflecting on the organizations that we support to ask, are they doing good work? Is this work that we are doing with them rather than just for them? So there's a lot of good that's been done. But primarily our work, at those of us who are white middle class, is to help other people who are white and middle class recognize the harm that's been done because of white culture, because of racialization. What I'm doing today mostly is this information and analysis. But I can think of, I was thinking about this as I was putting this together, that in the last 2 or 3 weeks, I can name 4 or 5 specific instances where I saw someone operating out of whiteness in a way that I knew was not helpful. And I had a choice in those moments to say something or to not say something. And in all of the cases I'm thinking of right now, I didn't say anything. I didn't choose to go past just giving information to sort of breaking in and asking, why did you respond that way? Or do you recognize how doing this in this moment really fits into white culture, and how do you think that might have made the other people in the room feel who aren't white? If anybody's interested in knowing what those specifics are, I can tell you one-on-one, but I can think of several very clear places where in my mind I thought, oh, that's about whiteness. That's whiteness happening there. And that if that's not talked about in some way at some point, that could lead to someone being hurt or things not moving forward the way they could. So, and I think, so that's what our job is, I think, more than any of the other things. There are communities and people of color and communities of color who are doing amazing good work about bringing justice to these communities. And we must be in relationship with those and supporting those and asking, what can we do? But what we can do that's unique as white and middle class people is talk to our white and middle class friends, have conversations with them when they say something. And it doesn't even, the things I'm thinking of aren't even somebody made a racist joke or somebody made a racist comment. It's not even that. It's other ways in which I'm seeing whiteness at work, and that I think a conversation could be warranted. So I think that's all that I have to share. It's 10:30, so we have about 15 minutes. If there are any questions, I'm gonna come out of, actually, let me show you the one more slide that has some, really just a small handful of resources. My last day as an intern with the congregation is next week. So in this next week, my task is to put together a curated list of resources. I know that the congregation has a document where people have been adding books and podcasts and things like that, but I'm hoping to take that information and some other things I have and break it down. So if you want to learn more about whiteness, here's some resources. If you want to learn about the history of whiteness or the history of race in this country, here are some resources. But for now, these are some that in putting this together, some that I looked at. So The Heart of Whiteness, which I mentioned. White Awareness by Judith Katz. I don't even know if that's in print anymore. It was something published in like 1978, I think. The reason it came to my attention was because within the last year or two, the Smithsonian Museum of African American History published on their website an infographic of white culture. A lot of the things on my list some of those were pulled from that. I found it extremely helpful because I think we have a hard time recognizing those things, and this was a nicely produced infographic with a lot of information on it. It was almost immediately pulled down because there was a huge backlash by white conservatives, especially media personalities, who were saying, this is racist, how can you say that all white people are like this? There was a huge outcry and offense taken that anybody would put together a list like this. And that is one of the aspects of whiteness in operation, because as white people, we often think of ourselves as individuals, and to be lumped into a group and to say that I'm part of a group of white people, a lot of people get offended by that because, well, I'm not like that. I'm my own person. But the reality is we are influenced by the people around us. So anyway, that infographic that was then taken down was adapted from work by Judith Katz in this book called White Awareness. So I'm crediting that for that reason. Be the Bridge 101, again, as I mentioned, the Be the Bridge book is a good intro, but the Be the Bridge 101 curriculum is, I think it's a 8 to 10 week curriculum of discussions about these issues of whiteness. Really helpful. And then this last one, Indigenous Theology in the Western Worldview, by Randy Woodley, it's actually not out yet. It comes out on April 19th. But some of the stuff I've learned from Randy, I think, is going to be in this book, looking at some of the 10 pathologies of Western worldview that he talks about. He has 10 missional imperatives that ways that Christians should think about mission differently than the ways white cultural mission has been done in the past. So this comes out, like I said, on April 19th, and I highly recommend anything by Randy Woodley. He has several other books as well. those are some resources. I can get those to you if you didn't get it, if you wanted to take a screenshot or something real quick, but I can also let you know what those are, and I'm going to stop sharing so I can see the land. And if anyone has any questions, and Nelson, would you be able to monitor the chat questions or anything for Zoom? And I'll take. Thank you for giving me the chance to share today.
As is our habit, let's unmute, or for those of you in the room, just move your hands and express your appreciation for the inspiring message today. Next week is Easter, and the bad news is we're going to deprive you of this class. The good news is we're not going to exert any undue influence over what time you want to go to a worship service. But join us or tune in again in 2 weeks. And the Reverend Christian Wilson, who has contributed from the back row today, will be up front. And his topic is Best Western It Is Not, the text of the book of Acts. Come learn about that.
Up for the summer class.